Just 72 hours passed after the last general election before the new Prime Minister Boris Johnson met with Rupert Murdoch. We'll never know what was discussed at that meeting, or for that matter, at any of the other meetings Mr. Murdoch and the government have shared since the last election. What we do know is that over the last 5 years, Murdoch's interests have consistently been put before those of the public. The public inquiry into evidence of corruption among the police and the press, Leveson Part 2 as it's known, was abruptly cancelled by the government before it could begin its work. That decision was opposed by a majority of the public, by international free speech advocates like Article 19, by the National Union of Journalists, and by the inquiry chair, Sir Brian Leveson himself. They all understood that a web of criminality and corruption exposed by the first part of the Leveson inquiry needed proper investigation. But instead of taking a tough stand on crime and corruption, the government buckled to appease Mr. Murdoch and other press owners and executives. The government has also stood by as Mr. Murdoch's papers have peddled conspiracy theories, fake news and disinformation. And earlier this year, it was no surprise when the government funneled £35 million into the coffers of the largest newspapers in a COVID advertising deal, including Murdoch's titles, of course, while their independently owned competitors were left to rot. Instead of implementing the Leveson recommendations for an independent regulator, the Prime Minister has done nothing, while Murdoch's papers persist with Ipso, a sham complaints handler controlled by press executives with close links to the government. Chaired by a former Conservative government politician, the Ipso system fails to protect the public. Its closeness to government is more befitting of a dictatorship than a liberal democracy. Our Prime Minister may not have the stomach to take on the press, but this evening we hear from someone who does. Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010 and again in 2013. During his time in office, he led Australia's response to the global financial crisis of 2008, took decisive action on climate change, and made an unprecedented apology to Indigenous Australians for the forced removals of children earlier in the 20th century. He did this against a backdrop of Murdoch dominance in Australian media, filled with the climate change denialism and the kind of right-wing populism we've come to expect from Murdoch outlets. Now a petition launched by Mr. Rudd calling for a royal commission into Australian media ownership has been signed by more than 500,000 Australians concerned about Murdoch's dominance. Here is that rare thing, a world leader with the courage to stand up for the public and call out the damaging influence Murdoch wields over politicians. I am delighted to introduce him this evening, and I hope Boris Johnson's taking some notes. In conversation with Hacked-Off Board Director Professor Stephen Barnett, the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd.
Kevin Rudd, thank you very much for doing this. As Hugh said, you launched a petition in October calling for a royal commission, quote, to ensure a strong, diverse Australian news media, which specifically takes aim at Murdoch's media dominance in Australia. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary step for a former Prime Minister. What persuaded you to do it?
Well, in this country, it had just gone too far. It's a gradual process, but over the last decade, Murdoch's abuse of his media monopoly in this country just reached unprecedented heights. Murdoch owns 70% of the print media in Australia. In my home state of Queensland, which is the third largest in Australia, he owns 100% of the print media. And so as a result, it is simply the outworking of a monopoly power, which, whether it was of the left or the right, frankly, is just bad for the democracy. But secondly, the abuse of the monopoly power here has driven the media agenda and the political agenda to the right and the far right. In fact, I fear that the long-term trajectory for Australia's media landscape would be what Murdoch has already pulled off in America with Fox News. So I simply took a decision, which is enough is enough. It's time to stand up and to try and do something, which is why I launched this petition to establish a royal commission into his abuse of media monopoly power.
Now, the petition specifically says that the way he uses his powers to attack opponents in business and politics by blending editorial opinion with news reporting, and Australians who hold contrary views have felt intimidated into silence. And in your book, you actually call Murdoch the greatest, most malignant cancer on our Australian democracy. Now, those are pretty forceful words. You yourself been on the receiving end of that kind of intimidation. Can you give us a sense of how it actually works and how it affects senior politicians and people who are trying to lead the country?
Well, actually, the most eloquent depiction of this, I thought, came recently from a former Murdoch employee in the United Kingdom, who was interviewed recently for the BBC three-part series on Murdoch's power, said that if you cross Murdoch, it's a bit like having an entire division of the SS descend on you, because that's how he operates. And his policy and strategy is very clear, to silence you, but more importantly, to use you as an example to others, not to raise your voice against the leader of this particular syndicate and the abuse of their power. What I therefore have objected to most acutely in Australia is just the culture of fear it creates here. Most people that I speak to in the political class of the mainstream centre-left and centre-right agree with everything that I have said publicly. But most would always say, oh, mate, you'll understand why I'm not speaking out. He'll just come after me. Now, I understand that. I mean, they're in active politics. I left the political scene 6 or 7 years ago. But it's an indication where we've got to, where no one feels confident enough to actually call a spade in dealing with the Murdoch beast. It becomes somewhat like the political equivalent of a mafia operation, whereby you fear the reputational damage, the evisceration of your character, and frankly, the falsification of news as they seek to destroy anyone who stands against either their ideological or their business interests.
And presumably that has an impact on any government's ability to act in the national interest if they're trying to do something that's contrary to the Murdoch worldview.
I think that's true. I mean, I make no apology for the fact that prior to my own election as Prime Minister, I went to see Murdoch and spent a lot of time with Murdoch's editors, trying to get a better deal for the coverage of the Labor Party going into the 2007 election. But I think no one would argue that as Prime Minister of Australia, that I did anything for Murdoch. In fact, it was probably a failure to do anything for Murdoch, and in fact, prosecuting an agenda which he found ideologically and commercially uncomfortable for him, that he turned so viciously against my government. So therefore, it is the culture of fear for prime ministers and senior cabinet ministers and even backbenchers that the safest and most secure political future for yourself is carved out by never ever crossing the business or the ideological interests of the Murdoch beast. Because if you do, you'll find out about it, if not the next day, then certainly the next week on the front pages of the paper.
I want to come back to your time in office in a minute. Just one question before I do. This petition got over 500,000 signatories before it was closed, which is a pretty extraordinary number in a population of 25 million. Is this something that you think has struck a popular nerve as well as a political nerve? Is this something that people in Australia actually talk about and worries them?
Yeah, I think so, and people who are not normally engaged in formal political discussion of the type that we're having here. These, if you simply go into a shop somewhere in Australia to buy a pie, you'll be surprised the number of people who will say, "I signed your petition, Kev. I just think it's wrong. No one should have that much power." And I get that right across the country, and not from political elites, but from ordinary people, because they formed a view that no one in the media in our country should have that much power in their hands. They've seen too much evidence of its abuse. One of the areas of abuse which has touched people most acutely across the country was Murdoch's intervention with the Conservative parties here going into the 2013 election, when they agreed to fundamentally change the nature of our policy and plan which was being implemented at the time to roll out a national broadband network for the entire nation. Australia, as you know, is vast in its size, small in its population, and so to overcome the tyranny of distance and to link the country with the economy of the 21st century, we undertook to build a massive project, $43 billion project, of fibre optic to the premises for every household and business in the country, the railways of the 21st century. Murdoch got wind of this and figured that the problem with our proposal was that it would create direct and immediate competition for his existing cable television entertainment network called Fox Entertainment here in Australia, by enabling, therefore, companies like Netflix to use the fibre optic link to people's homes to basically sell their own movie and entertainment services as competition to Murdoch. So Murdoch went on the warpath, and the Conservatives went into the 2013 election at a campaign launch at Murdoch's own Fox studios in Sydney and promised that they would only have a national broadband network which did not deliver fibre optic to the home, but stopped short, and that the last link would be copper, thereby slowing down the entire delivery, and thereby undermining the broadband revolution which we had planned for Australian society and the whole economy. The net result 7 years later, in the midst of a COVID lockdown, is that most Australians have had absolutely crappy broadband. So this penetrates through to people everywhere. It's not just, an elite concern about high politics. It's that this guy's ruthless prosecution of his business interests affects their ability to get decent broadband to run their small business in Udnadatta.
And presumably it's very difficult for a party, as you were in 2013, to put across the benefits to ordinary people of decent, fast, direct-to-home broadband when you're faced with a propaganda barrage by a powerful publisher.
Very much so. As you know, a lie repeated often enough in the mind of many becomes the truth. I think that has been used in an earlier period in world politics, which we thought we'd got over. And certainly when you're in the business of simply seeking to advance an argument, whether it's on climate change or the National Broadband Network, which is, here are the facts of what we face. Here is what we're planning to build. Here's the timetable for doing it. Here's the advantages which will flow. For running your business from home or having an effective ability to move people's medical records at speed across the country through patient-controlled medical records or remote area medicine, etc. But the way in which Murdoch operates is that not only does he deny you the space to do that, that the barrage you face instead is always cleverly masked. It's never about his commercial interests directly. It's about the massive cost blowout of the system or massive inefficiencies in laying it out, all to discredit, delegitimize the project, but importantly, to delegitimize the people trying to roll out the project, namely me as Prime Minister at the time. That's the way in which he operates. It's also, as we discussed at the beginning of this interview, the convergence of fact with opinion so that it becomes as one, and therefore the ability to form a rational judgment just based on the facts is denied 70% of the country because they're reading a propaganda broadsheet.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're familiar with in the UK as well. This sort of the blending of opinion and news. Can I just go back 1 minute to the 2007 election? And you said that you went to meet Murdoch before that election, and I remember Blair telling the Leveson inquiry very much the same thing, that he felt it was important. This was a powerful publisher, and he needed to talk to him. Do you feel at the time that you felt it necessary to make any compromises in policy terms, in the conversations that you had with him in order to get elected?
No, I didn't. I simply explained to him what my program was across the board because I had no confidence that his individual editors would have done that fairly. So I wanted to say what I was going to do on business, small business, and in areas of environmental policy and social policy and the rest. But Murdoch's a clever beast, you know. He works out when the natural political cycle is about to turn. And he figured in this case, in Australia, with 12 years of Conservative government before me, that my predecessor's time was about up. And even if they launched a massive media campaign against me, which in part they did still, it was unlikely that they would prevent me from being elected. And so therefore, usually at about 5 minutes to midnight, they click in and try to provide, quote, a bit of balanced coverage until they then seek to extract your carotid artery after the election. And that's very much his manner of proceeding. But a direct answer to your question is, did I provide any policy undertakings? Zero. And the record of my government is we delivered zero in terms of the Murdoch ideological agenda or the Murdoch business agenda. As I said, that's probably explained why he subsequently turned on me, my government, so viciously.
Well, that's where I wanted to go to next, because there was a famous case when the British Prime Minister John Major gave evidence to Leveson, saying that in the run-up to the '97 election here, Murdoch made it clear to him that he didn't like Major's policies on Europe and expected him to change those policies in return for Murdoch's support. And Major refused, and there was a landslide, which may or may not have been coincidental, in the '97 election for Labour. So when Murdoch turned, and during that period of government leading up to 2010, were any similar kind of overtures made to you? This is what I want you to do, and if you don't, then you can expect us to turn against you? Or did the worm just turn without any warning?
No, there was nothing like that prior to the election, and if there had been, I would have rejected it. And the evidence, as I said, in the track record is after the event. There is nothing in our policy record in government which reflects any such undertaking to the Murdoch beast. You see, again, Murdoch's overall play is that in our case, he would regard Labor governments as episodic irritations to be dispensed with as rapidly as possible, unless they became centre-right governments in their own form. I was never a centre-right government. We ran a quite radical interventionist strategy on the economy to deal with the global financial crisis. We ran an interventionist strategy, certainly on the environment, and we also brought about fundamental reforms to the public health system in the country as well, and the education system, state education system. So he would have found, I think, very little to cheer about. Barely 6 months into my government, the program of delegitimising me as the leader of the government then began in earnest. I remember the day, I think in about June of 2008, when the front pages of the paper ran as a news story the word chaos, which was their attempt to describe the internal workings of my government. As the subsequent documentary histories have demonstrated at the period, it was a normal, methodical, cabinet-led government. But because we were not bending the knee to the Murdoch beast, they decided to unleash their editors against us. And they did. And it became vicious, personal, ugly, and from their point of view, ultimately successful.
Did you have journalists privately apologising? I mean, do Murdoch journalists simply say, "I'm really sorry, this is the job that we've been told to do," or was it simply without apology, these are the headlines, these are the stories, take it or leave it?
No, they routinely privately apologise. And the number of private apologies, it makes you feel like a Catholic priest sometimes, the number of confessions you have to hear in the secret of the secular confessional from all these Murdoch journos who say, "Oh, mate, it wasn't me. I got told to do it. Sorry about that." Or the other favourite one of mine is, "I didn't write that story which appears under my byline. It was rewritten by the editors on instructions from on high." And to the point where you can see a story which is white turned into a story which is black. And so I've lost count of the number of Murdoch journalists, and even a number of people who have occupied editorial positions who, in the quietness of the confessional, will let you know off the record the amount of pressure they've come under. So it's a strange beast.
I guess some of them will have signed the petition as well, but maybe anonymously.
Actually, I got a message today from a former Murdoch employee who said she'd signed, and she'd acted as an editor, that she'd signed the petition, and she said most of her former Murdoch employee friends and some current ones had signed it as well.
That's very interesting. Do you think that you talked about how things worked in your 07 to 2010 administration? Do you think that Murdoch's right-wing views have become more pronounced over the last 10 years? Some people look at point to Fox News in the States and the New York Post and suggest that that they become more shrill and more partisan over the last 10 years. Is that your view in Australia?
Yeah, you see, one of the reasons I've decided to speak out now rather than 10 years ago, even though this was bad then, it was bad then, but it's become bloody impossible now. If I could summarize it in these terms, in around about when I was first elected in 2007, in the Murdoch media was probably then about 70-30 against the Australian Labor Party in terms of the balance of news coverage and editorial opinion. My job was to try and get it down to something closer to 50-50. But during that election campaign of 07, when people often say, but he backed you, well, for God's sake, there were at least 3 or 4 attempts in the lead up to that election to take my head off altogether on a whole series of concocted personal scandals. People seem to have forgotten those because I survived them. But what has happened in the period since 2010, over the last decade, is that, 70-30 figure has become close to 100-0. And if you want an evidence point of that, we've done this research recently. Because we're a federation in Australia, we have both national and state elections. In the last decade, we've had 19 federal and state elections in this country. In all 19 of those, the Labor Party has been campaigned viciously against by the Murdoch media. All of Murdoch's daily tabloid papers, which dominate the news in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Adelaide. Only in Perth, they're not the mainstream paper. Quite apart from the national daily paper, the Australian, and their equivalent of Fox in Australia, which is Sky on television. In 19 out of 19, this is not a statistical error, this is 19 out of 19, you see this vicious campaign. And it's not just the pre-election editorial, which says, on the balance of all the factors concerned, we've decided as a editorial team of this newspaper that we're going to endorse the Conservative parties or endorse the Labor Party. That wouldn't worry me so much. But it's the overwhelming bias in the lead up and through the campaigns, which, as I said, runs almost 100-0. And it continues with a degree of arrogance, which I think friends in the UK would find sort of just breathtaking in terms of how bad it gets. Here in my own home state of Queensland, we've only just had another election where we calculated the bias factor again by looking at each day's coverage of the state election campaign. And in this state, which is a decentralised state, all the newspapers, the Cairns Post, the Townsville Bulletin, the Mackay Mercury, the Rockhampton Morning Bulletin, the Bundaberg News Mail, right down to the Sunshine Coast Daily, the Brisbane Courier Mail, the Gold Coast Bulletin, all of them are Murdoch owned and vicious in their anti-Labor coverage. As I said, 19 out of 19 is not a statistical error.
And it's definitely become more partisan over the last few years, in your view. And presumably we're talking here not just about, as you say, the editorials saying vote for the other side, but the choice of news stories, the agenda setting, the headlines on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's it's become positively Pravda-like for a far-right conservative agenda. I could best summarise it in these terms. In the period that I was a leader of the Australian Labor Party and Prime Minister, the Murdoch media, by and large, was a centre-right group. In the last 10 years, it's become a far-right group on the normal barometers of policy. For example, on climate change, the Murdoch media here is the largest single factor driving the Conservative Party in this country continually in the direction of a denialist agenda, despite the fact that Australia is the driest continent on earth and therefore is already the recipient of one of the harshest impacts of climate change already underway. But because of Murdoch's far-right ideology on climate change, where he's on the record directly disputing the science, and his son Lachlan Murdoch is no better, this has a palpable impact on the way in which politics is conducted in this country and on policy issues of relevance to everybody. I think that's the other factor in this debate. It's not just the abuse of editorial and news power to campaign viciously for one side of politics against the other, because some would say that's a publisher's right. I actually think publishers have broader responsibilities than that in the separation of news reporting and opinion. But the other pernicious effect of the abuse of this monopoly in Australia is that it utterly skews the parameters for our national conversation about our critical national futures, including on climate, which for us is increasingly existential. So this is not a minor matter. It's not just, the political, boutique political interests of a centre-left party. It actually goes to the very lifeblood of the democracy. So when I say it's a cancer on our democracy, I actually mean that. It's withering away the vitality of the body politic.
And essentially what you're saying is that people's everyday lives, whether it's in terms of access to quick broadband, doing something about climate change, are actually being influenced by the Murdoch's editorial approach to those issues.
Very much so. I mean, there are institutions which have done systematic analyses, for example, of Murdoch's coverage in just the last year or two on climate change. Overwhelmingly, the news/opinion pages of the Murdoch papers are dominated by climate change denialist writers, almost to a factor 100 to 0. But then the news coverage is not a whole lot better. There's one further pernicious impact, though. If such a dominant media monopoly in any country, be it of the centre-left or the centre-right, or the far-left or the far-right, effectively becomes a protection racket for their preferred political party in office. And that's what's happened here. The Murdoch party, as I call them in Australia, functioning almost as a political party in coalition with the Conservative parties who formally contest elections here. What happens as a consequence of that, when you act as a protection racket for so long, it actually produces corruption. And what we've seen in recent years in Australia is Australia, bit by bit, starting to slide down the Transparency International Index. And there's a correlation here. The federal government in Australia, for 100 years, has been one of the cleanest in the world, just because of the high calibre of our public institutions and also a fairly forensic media. But if you have a media which is increasingly coward, guess what? Corruption begins to creep in. And I've now lost count of the number of corruption scandals, small and great, which have now erupted in federal politics in this country, to the point that we now have an active and necessary debate on the establishment of a federal anti-corruption commission. 10 years ago, when I was Prime Minister, this was never debated, because neither my predecessor, Mr. Howard, could be accused of being corrupt. No one was able to label any accusations of corruption against my government. But here we are a decade later, and there are literally 7 or 8 significant corruption scandals brewing. And I'm not talking about the standard fare in politics, which is politicians or parliamentarians abusing their expense entitlements. That comes and goes depending on the season. I'm talking about the abuse of public funds in significant quantums for one thing or another. So when I say cancer on the democracy, it's, as I said, constraining the parameters of public debate and public discussion, acting as a protection racket for a preferred political party which is seen as the most useful in looking after the ideological and business interests of the media mogul in question. But then the consequence is, by acting as a protection racket, the body politic becomes more corrupt. And that is one of the other reasons I fear for the simple continuation of current arrangements.
There's clearly a lot of backing, political backing, both privately and publicly, for your position. Given the impact on the body politic, on public interest policies, shouldn't politicians simply be a bit braver and stand up to him, or is that just being naive?
Look, I am often attacked in my current capacity for not having stood up a decade ago, to which my response is, it wasn't as bad then as it is now. It was pretty bad then, but it's much, much worse now. And the evidence, the quantifiable evidence, is already there. And secondly, to be fair to our government, we did initiate an initial inquiry into media diversity in 2012 called the Finkelstein Inquiry, which drew heavily on some of the work already done by Lord Leveson in the United Kingdom. And so for those reasons, I think the criticisms of us for not having acted decisively earlier are somewhat misplaced. But I am very much conscious of the pressures which members of parliament and leaders of political parties are under, because the Murdoch beast has their careers in their hands on a daily basis. And one of the reasons I've gone to the public and to the people direct is along these lines, Steve. It's to say, be strong and of a good courage, because actually the people are fed up with this. The ordinary people of our country are fed up with this. And to demonstrate through sheer numbers that there is a large swathe of people who are not just fed up, but want things to change. And I think over time that should give the political class more courage to act. But I only launched this petition a couple of months ago. And if you launch a digital petition in our country, you are given a maximum of 28 days where it can be online. And I think the body politic was stunned in Australia that we could collect 500,000 signatures, when you won't be surprised to know that through that whole period, the Murdoch media never reported its existence once.
I'm shocked and horrified. So just thinking, taking that into the future, where the petition takes us, there's now going to be a Senate inquiry into media diversity in Australia, which I understand isn't going to be reporting until well into next year. Is that going to make any difference? And are there, do you think there are any chances of real policy change in this area in the short to medium term?
Yes, I believe there are, because the public mood is mounting in this country. And the public mood is not a fickle thing. It's actually grown up over a long period of time. Australians, by and large, as you know from your own experience of us, we're a fairly relaxed bunch of people down here. And it takes quite a lot to make people angry. They're angry about this. And so I believe this mood will grow and become more intense. And interestingly, each time the Murdoch media in the last couple of months have tried to take my head off through further reporting of my crimes against humanity, whatever they happen to be on a given day in the Murdoch media, there's always a new one. The mood of the Australian public is now one which describes Murdoch's reaction to this as Murdoch panic. Spontaneous hashtags spring up around the country. Murdoch petition panic. I haven't produced these, just the public are producing these. There's an organic movement underway. And so what's my aspiration and belief? That we will achieve policy and legislative change. I can't give you a precise timetable for it. The Senate inquiry was not my idea. It spontaneously combusted in the Australian Parliament the week after my petition closed, because the senators saw the mood change. And this Senate inquiry will haul people, I presume, from News Corporation before them to give evidence. This will be very interesting to observe as to how it unfolds. It'll be one stepping stone in a much longer term process. As for the fate of a Royal Commission, let's wait and see whether federal or state governments take up the particular request of more than 500,000 Australians. But this is a broader exercise as well. In the last 24 hours, I've launched a further national appeal to Australians, asking them to join my pledge not to use Murdoch's company, which is called realestate.com.au, which is Murdoch's online platform for advertising the purchase and sale of properties in this country, of houses, and for rental properties, and the advertisement of them as well. It's 62% owned by Murdoch. I saw a valuation saying it's a $19 billion company. And given that most of his print operations in this country do not earn a profit, this is his profit center in the country. So what I've gone out literally in the last few days and said is, if you're fed up with Murdoch's attitude to climate change, then join me in my pledge not to use realestate.com for the future. Now, I think this will, if I thought I had some enemies in News Corporation as of yesterday, I think I'm about to get a whole lot more, because it actually goes to the very beating, pulsating heart of the Murdoch financial beast. So, but I think...
Just a couple more questions, just on that particular one, a personal question, if you like. I mean, you've clearly decided to stick your head, well, not just your head, but every part of your anatomy above the parapet. And you look pretty relaxed. Is there part of you that's actually a bit apprehensive about the stuff that's going to be coming your way from a very powerful publisher?
Not really. And the reason is that for more than a decade, I've had most things thrown at me by these folks. And there's an advantage and an upside for them having done so much in the past, and that is the currency has been debased. And frankly, if I, as a former Prime Minister of the country, am too frightened to put my head up, for God's sake, how can we expect the same of those who are currently in office? So I think there's something of a ethical responsibility here to demonstrate some leadership. I'm sure members of my family don't particularly appreciate it, because when you're in political and public life in this country, they tend to go after you on a broad front. And as I said, that wonderful interview from the former, I think, News of the World reporter in the BBC three-part series recently on Murdoch said, just get ready for that full division of the SS to descend on your personal life if you're a politician who stands in the road of the beast. But I'm in the business of making a change in public life. Volume 1 of my autobiography is entitled Not for the Faint-Hearted. And let me tell you, taking on Murdoch is not for the faint-hearted. It's full-blooded warfare. Never show up in a fight with Murdoch with a butter knife. It's a street fight, and you need to know that before you do so.
Final question. I think there'll be many on the receiving end of that kind of vituperation that you've described, who will be wishing you luck and perhaps coming to join you in the fight. In the UK, there are a number of politicians who still believe that cozying up to Murdoch and adapting media policy to suit his agenda is a price worth paying to get elected if it wins his paper's support. Do you think that's right?
You know, a decade ago, or a decade and a half ago, I would, as I said in my earlier comments, I make no criticism of political party leaders dealing with publishers and editors across the spectrum of the left and the right. And I didn't just go and see Murdoch. I saw other editors from other newspaper and media organisations as well. Because your job as leader of a political party is to maximise the fair and balanced coverage of your particular argument. But there is a huge line to be drawn on doing that and arguing your case with those media barons and publishers on the one hand, to prostituting yourself on the other. To be very plain, one of our problems with the Murdoch beast was, as the Australian Labor Party, then in opposition, when I was Shadow Foreign Minister, our vitriolic hostility to the Iraq War from the get-go. And so the attacks on us in Australian politics, particularly when the British Labor government under Tony Blair went the other way, the attacks on us through the Murdoch media at the time was that we were somehow lacking in patriotism, lacking in alliance solidarity, and not providing bipartisan support for the then Australian Conservative government in the invasion of Iraq and what followed. So the reason I use that as an example is it's far better in the overall swings and roundabouts of history to stick up for your principles all the way through. You usually come unstuck in the business of public life and public policy and public politics when you fundamentally compromise on those principles. People understand in political life and the nature of parliamentary politics that some elements of compromise are necessary for legislation, for example, to pass. I understand that. I do get that. But when you engage in acts of fundamental compromise to appease public opinion as defined by a newspaper baron, whose global agenda is far-right ideology, playing always the politics of race, denying and undermining climate change action wherever he can, and minimising tax so that he has to pay less tax as a corporation, as an individual. My argument is that when such a publishing empire has such a large foothold across the Anglosphere, we have a responsibility to stand up and to push back. Because you know something, one of the dilemmas in the West at the moment, across the wider West, in our democratic capitalist world, led by the United States, in the United Kingdom and in Australia, is that Murdoch has had a pernicious influence on all of us the last decade or more. In America, I doubt we would have ever seen Trump in the absence of Murdoch's Fox News. I believe the Republican Party would have remained a mainstream centre-right party were it not for the echo chamber of Fox News playing to the far-right constituency permanently within the broader Republican establishment. And so the impact in the United Kingdom, I'm not sure Brexit would have happened in the absence of Murdoch's championing it through The Sun and through his other media interests. Maybe it would have, but I've noticed the relationship between Farage, for example, and Murdoch is surprisingly close. So the impact of this extraordinary phenomenon across these three English-speaking countries, which have played such a significant role in, let's call it, the evolution of the idea of the West in the last couple of hundred years since the American Revolution. This is a bad development, not just for Oz, it's a bad development for all of us. And the sooner we stand up and defeat this, the better for all of our democracies.
I think that's a great call to arms on which to finish, and I think there are some politicians in the UK who would do well to listen, to be honest, as well as in the US. Kevin, thank you very, very much for your time. It's been a really interesting insight into having to deal with, as you say, the beast at first hand, and the consequences, I think, not just for Australian democracy, but for democracies, as you say, in the Anglosphere. So thank you again. There'll be a lot of people here cheering you on and watching very carefully to see what happens in the Senate and whether a Royal Commission and subsequent legislation actually emerges. And maybe Australia could be the standard bearer for the rest of the world. So thank you again, and I'm going to hand back to Hugh Grant.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for joining us for this special Hacked Off event. Murdoch's influence crosses borders, with the UK, Australia and the US all affected. It's important that we work together to protect our democracies. You can read more about what we at Hacked Off are doing to hold Murdoch and other newspapers owners to account on our website at hackinginquiry.org and on Twitter. Do sign up as a supporter if you've not already done so. Finally, we at the campaign want to extend our thanks to Kevin Rudd for being a part of this event this evening. We hope you enjoyed hearing from him. Thanks a lot.